Chapter 2. Jews and Slavery in Colonial North America. The Jews arrived in North America primarily as refugees from Brazil and from the island of the Caribbean and met a population quite different from their own. The American colonies represented a land of farmers and seaport merchants, and as late as the mid-18th century, 9/10 of the inhabitants made their living from the soil. As many as 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire Revolutionary Era population came from the class of indentured servants, a class whose members were primarily the purged criminals of European jails. The Jews, on the other hand, were of the mercantile class, with an entrepreneurial tradition and a worldwide network of commercial relationships. The majority of these Jews were by no means poor and destitute huddled masses, but instead were highly skilled and savvy businessmen whose wealth on arrival far surpassed that of many other immigrants. As most all the early Jewish settlers in America belonged to the wealthy class, writes historian Peter Wernick, it was natural for them to accept the institution of slavery as they found it, and to derive as much benefit from it as other affluent men. The earliest Jewish settlements were established in Newport, Rhode Island, and New York, where there were numerous Jewish slaveholders long before and right through the American Revolution. Jews adapted to the business climate of colonial North America and operated with the same skill they had demonstrated in the island region to the south and accepted black slavery without question. In the North before 1800, and in the South all through the colonial period, slaves were stocked as commodities by Jewish merchants. Countless thousands of Africans were brought here in colonial times as slaves by Jewish merchant shippers, and in the South, Jews began to enter the planter class in substantial numbers. It should be made very plain at this point that even until the Civil War era, Jews as a community never interfered with the practice of slavery or registered any reservations about its dehumanization effects. When some colonies had proposed high tariffs on the importation of slaves, intending to discourage the slave trade, Jewish merchants Joseph Marks, Samson Levy, and David Franks protested, for they were among those who wished to see the traffic continued. Slavery was a business concern mitigated only by the bottom line. Regionally, one can discern no difference in the Jews' attitude or philosophy with regard to non-Jewish human bondage. Says Bertram W. Korn, it would seem to be realistic to conclude that any Jew who could afford to own slaves and had need for their service would do so. The eminent Dr. Marcus confirms that in his recent book, United States Jewry, 1776 to 1985. All through the 18th century, into the early 19th, Jews in the North were to own black servants. In the South, the few plantations owned by Jews were tilled with slave labor. In 1820, over 75% of all Jewish families in Charleston, Richmond, and Savannah owned slaves, employed as domestic servants. Almost 40% of all Jewish slaveholders in the United States owned one slave or more. There were no protests against slavery as such by Jews in the South, where they were always outnumbered at least 100 to 1. But very few Jews anywhere in the United States protested against chattel slavery on moral grounds. Joseph Weinberg was just as direct as his paper to conservative American rabbis. Like other white men in the Caribbean and North America, some Jews were slave traders and slave holders. There were occasional attempts to restrict Jewish activity by limiting the number of slaves they could own and prohibiting the purchase of baptized slaves by Jews, but these provisions were not enforced. Like other merchants of their day, the Jews found the slave trade to be a profitable business. Some purchased Negroes to hire them out, while others worked them on their plantations. In their treatment and dealings with slaves, Jews behaved no better and no worse than other white men. At times they beat recalcitrant, stubborn slaves and had their share of black runaways. Several Jewish communities throughout North America took root and continued the same lucrative commercial operation that had brought them so much success in other areas of the globe. The slave market continued to offer the best return, and a mercantile experience of the Jews found them tooled and ready to take full advantage. New York. In May 1654, 16 ships carrying the Jews of Brazil set out for Holland. 15 reached their destination, but the 16th, carrying 23 Sephardi Jews, were blown off course. It was captured by Spanish pirates and its cargo confiscated, the vessel was sank, and the passengers held to be sold as slaves. But the pirate ship was sighted by a French bark, the St. Charles, and the prisoners were rescued. The penniless Jews were taken to New Amsterdam, the nearest port. This, the humble beginnings of the greatest of the world's Jewish community, as described by Max I. Diamant. Today, more Jews live in New York City than in any other single place on the globe, including Israel. There they wield immense influence, and there they first entered North America. When the first Jews arrived in New Amsterdam, later called New York, in 1654, it was to the chagrin, annoyance, of Peter Stuyvesant, the appointed director of the Dutch West India Company's Western Affairs. Speaking of a shipment of African slaves he had just received from Curaçao, Stuyvesant said he preferred them to the unbelieving Jews. He petitioned the company's director in Holland to exclude further Jewish colonists, but they replied that such action would be unreasonable and improper, especially in view of the big losses which this nation suffered from the conquest of Brazil, and in view of the great fortune which they have invested in the company. Stuyvesant's unwelcome of those 23 Jewish refugees from Brazil has been perceived as the Jews' first encounter with American anti-Semitism, but as author Hertzberg writes, though Stuyvesant did use such terms as Christ killers or Christ rejectors, as he fought against letting them stay in town, his quarrel with them was primarily economic. Generous land grants and privileges were awarded to those who agreed to farm the Caribbean island frontiers to provide much-needed staple crops for the western settlements. The Jews, through Joao de Ilan, were offered the Curaçaoan settlements under these conditions, but preferred instead to raise and smuggle horses and deal slaves. Stuyvesant, who was the former governor of Curaçao and those jurisdictions included the Caribbean islands, was left to continue the extensive importation of European crops. After this initial conflict, reports Leo Hershkowitz in the study of Jewish community development in New York, there was a high degree of toleration with few examples of overt anti-Semitism. For the most part, the Jews formed a separate class by their own predilection. There were no ghettos, nor were they confined to any portion of the city, but they tended to congregate on the dock ward fronting the East River. Their houses were exactly the same as all the other houses in town, and in 1777 the German mercenary John Dola commented that the Jews of New York were not like those of Europe, they were clean-shaven, dressed like everyone else, ate pork and intermarried without scruple. In colonial New York, Jews constituted a major segment of the mercantile population, and were an important part of colonial trade, a fact often overlooked by historians, complains Hershkowitz. They were engaged in money lending, brokering, and banking from the earliest colonial age. Slave dealing, then the most profitable of ventures, was financed through the New York bank firms, and though few records exist, the critical capital provided by these firms, capital that launched the African expeditions, cannot be understated. The trade of the Jewish merchants was primarily in agricultural products, exchange for rum, slaves, and manufactured goods. One recorded cargo included coconuts, coral, tobacco, turpentine, sturgeon, wine, rum, 2 Negro boys, and 1 mulatto slave. The Jews traded with their coreligionists in Curaçao, Suriname, St. Thomas, Barbados, Madeira, and Jamaica, referred to as the principal trading ports for New York outside of England. It should be mentioned that these ports were the very same places where Jewish settlements had been formed at an earlier date, and hence Jewish traders in New York had a marked advantage over others in the West India trade. Historian Peter Wernick flatly stated that this trade was principally in the hands of Jews, and Stanley Feldstein described the benefit. America's Jewish merchants, using their religio-commercial connections, enjoyed a competitive advantage over many non-Jews engaged in that same lucrative intercolonial trade. Since the West India trade was unnecessary to America's economy, and since this trade was, in varying degrees, controlled by Jewish mercantile houses, American Jewry was influential in the commercial destiny of Britain's overseas empire. In 1717 and 1721, the Crown and the New York Postilion, owned by Nathan Simpson and his New York and London associates, sailed into the northern harbor with a total load of 217 Africans. The shipment came directly from the African coast and were two of the largest slave cargoes to be brought into New York in the first half of the 18th century. In August of 1720, Simon the Jew, probably Simon Bonain or Bonave, was slave dealing. New York Jewish merchants were in several instances charged with and found guilty of selling demented and unsound slaves they had warranted as sound. Jews also held black slaves for their personal comfort and status. During the first half of the 1700s, black slaves constituted 20% of New York's population, with some Indians also held in slavery and with every New York family of any wealth or comfort owning slaves. By the 1720s, Jews formed their religious community, with some paying their tithes by sending a Negro slave to clean the synagogue. The Gomez family of New York were for many years the recognized heads of the Jewish community, and in 1741, slaves belonging to them, and to Abraham Myers Cohen, were accused of being involved in a threatened riot of insurrection. Sampson Simpson, one of the most prominent members of the New York Chamber of Commerce and one of the drafters of its constitutions, was the largest trader among the New York Jews during the year 1757 to 1773. He was the owner of a number of vessels engaged in trade with the East and West Indies, the Hardy, Sampson, Snow Union, and Polly among them. Jason Franks occasionally imported household slaves. The wealthiest Jewish families had domestic servants as a rule. Moses Beach's list of affluent New Yorkers includes the following Jewish names with their estimated wealth. Samuel Abrams, Abrahams, $150,000, 3.6 mil today. A.L. Gomez, $200,000, 4.8 mil today. David Hart, $250,000, 6.0 mil today. Uriah Hendricks, $300,000, 7.2 mil today. Widow Hendricks, Mrs. Harmon, $300,000, 7.2 mil today. Hyman, Solomon, Haim, M. Salomon, $100,000, 2.4 mil today. The following Jews were known dealers, owners, shippers, or supporters of the slave trade and of the enslavement of black African citizens in earlier New York history. Sales. In Savannah, on the 17th day of September next, at the booth of the late Miss Abigail Minnies, deceased. Sundry Negro slaves and families. The conditions will be made known on the day of sale. The Fuckvriber again notifies all persons who have demands to make them known. August 6, 1795, Leah Minnies Executive. Newport, Rhode Island. The almighty dispenser of all events now beholds a government which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance but generosity, affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming everyone of whatsoever nation or tongue or language equal parts of the great government machine. Moses Satius. Mr. Satius, of course, saw no irony in the fact that Newport, Rhode Island, had become one of the most active slave trading ports in North America with the significant assistance of his Jewish community. Indeed, as Jewish historians Edwin Wolfe and Maxwell Whiteman have reported, the Newport Jews traded exclusively in Negroes, and for the 30 years during which Newport was a major commercial center, Jewish traders saw their most prosperous and successful times. Rhode Island became the second largest slave dealing center, behind only South Carolina. Its three primary sources of wealth were the sugar trade, the slave trade, and the fisheries, especially whaling, and most Rhode Island merchants engaged in all three. By 1760, 15% of Newport's population were black slaves, supplying labor to the lucrative port industry and to the lavish estates of the Caucasian Jewish merchants. Newport was also the rum-producing center of the colonial world and the primary destination of the bulk of the sugar and molasses coming out of the West Indies. The infamous Triangle slave traders carried the rum into Africa in exchange for kidnapped black Africans, many of them murdered in the process. From here, many were taken to the West Indian plantations to produce the sugar for the insatiable profiteers of colonial America. The Jewish presence in Newport dates back to 1658, with another wave arriving in 1694 on a ship with a number of Jewish families of wealth and respectability on board who settled there, possibly from the Jewish stronghold of Curacao. But a new order was established in the 1750s, when hundreds of wealthy Israelites, a most distinguished class of merchants, moved here from Spain, Portugal, and Jamaica and entered largely into business. Among those were the families Lopez, Rivera, Pollock, Hart, and Hayes. Dr. Henry Feingold described the Jewish pilgrims. The first group of 15 Jewish families who arrived in Newport from Holland in the spring of 1658 were simple folk, soap boilers, brass workers, and small merchants. They owned 17 candle-making factories related to a wholly Jewish-owned spermaceti trust, 22 distilleries, 4 sugar refineries for the making of rum to be used domestically and for the African trade, 5 ropewalk factories, a Castile soap manufacturing combine, several furniture factories, a potash trust, and several smaller merchandising establishments. The Jews of Newport also maintain a sizable representation in the shipping and whaling industry. The people whom Henry Feingold described as simple folk, in fact, were the high-powered commercial engine of the Northeast. The Newport Jewish merchant played a leading and very important part in this commerce, utilizing their well-established ties in the West Indies and all the other colonies, as well in England. From every port in the Caribbean, Jewish merchants traders that their rivals often complained bitterly that they were monopolizing the West India trade. Spermaceti candle making, the electric utility of the colonial age, was controlled by Jews and was, in fact, the first American business monopoly. As in all colonial commerce, it required black slaves. Distilling required black cultivators and later, black processors. The manufacture of soap, a craft monopolized by Jews since the 14th century, required black manufacturers, most of whom were unpaid slaves of Jews. Even Negro mechanics of some skill helped build the Newport Synagogue. Newport slave trading Jews. Many Jews, if not directly implicated in the slave trade, showed passive acquaintances by engaging in trade directly tied to slavery, such as distilling, financing and insuring, shipbuilding and outfitting, installers of bondage hardware. The Rhode Island slave trade employed 100 to 150 vessels annually, estimated Dr. Marcus, each carrying to Jamaica 80 to 100 black men, women, and children. Feingold describes how the Jews were connected. From Africa they imported slaves, and from the West Indies they received molasses, from which they distilled rum. A key aspect of the triangular tree involved the notorious Middle Passage, the transportation of slaves from the west coast of Africa to the West Indies and eventually directly to the colonies. Newport was a major colonial port for this traffic in people, so that it comes as no surprise that colonial Rhode Island boasted a higher proportion of slaves than any other colony in America. Nearly all Jews in Newport had Negro domestic slaves. Bartlett, Rhode Island Census, 1771, shows only 2 Newport Jewish families without slaves. Some of those Jews with direct ties to slavery as slave owners and/or traders were Saul Brown, aka Prado, Isaac Eliezer, Neftali Hart, Jacob Isaacs, Aaron Lopez, Abraham Sarzitas, Sarah Lopez, Abraham Rivera, Moses Satius, Jacob Rodriguez Rivera, Joseph Isaacs, Simon Bonin, Amon Bonin, D. Lancina Jew, Moses Levy, Widow D. Robles, Isaac D. Marquez, Luis Gomez. The Newport Jewish community declined rapidly as a result of the Revolutionary War, as it was targeted by the British as a center of commerce. Newporters, however, plunged back into slaving after the Revolution in the desperate attempt to rebuild its own shattered economy. Newport's economy and untold lost black lives notwithstanding, the Jews prospered immensely and secured a significant part of their economy foundation from this port city. Pennsylvania. The Jews formed communities in Pennsylvania with diverse economic bases. To the westward Jewish Indian traders and military arms suppliers, while the eastern Jewish community based in Philadelphia comprised mainly merchant shippers. Philadelphia in 1663 was a small settlement of tiny cabins called Wicaco. Individual Jews appeared in Philadelphia records as early as 1703, But it would not be until 1738 that Jewish leadership formed to start a bona fide Jewish community. Joseph Simon, Jacob Franks, Nathan Levy, Solomon Edding, and the Gratz family, among others, were the most prosperous colonial families, and all practiced slavery. Levi Andrew Levi, an agent for Joseph Simon's operation, with his bride Susanna and their Negro female slave, proceeded westward on horseback, trailed by a file of horses laden with Simon's goods. Her slave, one of the first blacks in Pittsburgh, drew water, milked the cow, and cared for the horses. Two Jewish writers on the region's history, Edwin Wolfe and Maxwell Whiteman, cite a local example of a Jewish clergyman as an owner of slaves. The Reverend Jacob Cohen's short, teenage, bound girl wore a spotted jean jacket, a striped linsey petticoat, a spotted coarse shawl, and a black wired frame bonnet, when she ran away, and he was forced to offer $1 reward for anyone who would bring her home or take her to the jail. The Quakers were the only people who, as a religious denomination, opposed the institution of slavery. The Jews, who could afford them, had both servants and slaves. The Quakers were the only people who, as a religious denomination, opposed the institution of slavery. Jews became increasingly prominent and influential in colonial Pennsylvania. The firm of Levy, Franks and Simmons, founded 1751, became the most powerful Western merchant conglomeration of its time. It was their 250-ton, 10-gun ship Marilla that brought the 2,000-pound Liberty Bell to the Philadelphia State House. Jacob Franks is said to have gotten his share of business in armaments and slaves during Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, which gave Britain a monopoly in the slave trade. Philadelphia merchant Isaac Moses appears to have been associated with Joseph Reed, Robert Morris, and other businessmen in launching the first Bank of the United States, which supplied provisions to the Continental Army of the United States. Again, the wealthiest among them held slaves, who tended their businesses, ships, and homes. A published list of the wealthiest residents of Philadelphia included estimates of the estates of the following Jews in 1820. Jacob I. Florence, $500,000. William Florence, $150,000. Hyman Gratz, $75,000. Jacob Gratz, $50,000. Ahart, $150,000. Dr. Joseph Leon, $50,000. Joseph Levy, $75,000. L.J. Levy, $50,000. E. L. Moss, $50,000. John Moss, $300,000. Isaiah, estate, $60,000. G. D. Rosengarten, $150,000. The census of 1830 provides official data on the slave holdings of Philadelphia Jews. Jews of Western Philadelphia were at the edge of the frontier and helped to link the pioneers with the imported and manufactured goods found in the port cities. They established lucrative arrangements with the native population that anchored their capital growth. Jews and the Red Man. Jews were among those Europeans who saw the value of the fur pelts supplied by the Native American Indians and became known as Indian traders. Max J. Kohler writes that the Jews entered the New World through the Atlantic colonies, controlled by the English charters, and finally worked their way west, trading with the Indians. At first, this trade was forbidden to Jews in some Dutch-controlled regions, but they appealed to the West India Company at Amsterdam, and in 1656 the restrictions were lifted. Second only to the slave trade, Indian trading was the most profitable of commercial ventures. Cheap European trinkets and baubles, decorations, were traded for the fur pelts of the Indian trappers. Jacob Marcus recounts the involvement of some of the Jews in this commerce. Da Costa of Charleston advertised Indian goods in 1757, Isaac de Lyon and James Lucina of Savannah shipped out deer skins in the 1760s to pay for their English imports, and back in the woods, the Nunez brothers traded with the Indians, among whom they lived, and fathered a brood of half-breeds. But this commerce was more than a matter of bartering with local savages. They had in mind vast projects in the fields of Western trade and land development, and for this, they would necessarily have to gain the trust of various Indian organizations whose welcoming spirit welcomed the West to the Jews. The traders found themselves in a unique position to encourage and assist the Europeans in the extermination of the Indians. As traders in the wilderness, they knew the trails and the tribal locations, as well as the customs, wants, and needs of the Indians. As the European encroachment created lethal conflict, these Jewish traders often supplied the Europeans with weapons, staples, and critical military intelligence. Once the red man was removed, there was no one more advantageously positioned to seize the valuable land than the Indian trader. Rabbi I. Harold Sharfman points out that the Indians came to hate the white settlers with a passion, for they hacked down trees, leveled roads where the deer trails ran, killed off their buffalo and deer, and drove away wild game. But still they were intrigued by the strange wares of the peddlers and the new sensations that came with the spirit in the bottle. Joseph Simon was one of those Jewish peddlers that, according to Rabbi Sharfman, bartered with the tribes, exchanging colorful trinkets and a variety of eye-catching beads and the like for valuable furs. Little did the Indians realize that they were bartering away their civilization. The iron kettles, shooting irons, and sundries they acquired for furs meant that they had to kill for many pelts that exceeded their need for clothing, food, and shelter. Dependency on the white man's whiskey led to quarrelsomeness and murder of fellow braves. They fell prey to the disease of the pale face, for which they had no immunity: smallpox, measles, and sexual diseases. Simon was one of those who supplied those items that would eventually degenerate the Indian nation. He came to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, about 1735, and soon became one of the most prominent Indian traders and merchants, and one of the largest landholders in America. His land claims extended over Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, to the Mississippi River. In the Indian Territory, he had business interest with fellow Jews Bernard and Michael Gratz, David Franks, Solomon Edding, Chalander, and Levi Andrew Levi. Simon, John Miller, and brewer Mordecai Moses decided to process hard liquor to introduce into the Indian trade. When it appeared that war was imminent between the French, Indians, and the British, Simmons began to make guns. By the 1770s, it was said that the Simon conglomerate had a virtual monopoly on the Western trade. Other Jews made their fortunes exploiting the hapless Indian population. Haman Levy Company was a leading Indian trader, and Benjamin Lyon was its agent. Later, Levi, Lyons and Company became the largest fur trader of the colonies and one of the most opulent merchants in the city. Haman Levi shipped many goods to the western frontier, including a 1763 shipment that included iron, steel, paints, dry goods, scalping knives, and Negro slaves. Levy's business ethics were challenged in this 1774 letter to Levi from the copybook of Colonial merchant Ephraim S. Williams. I am far from being satisfied with your persisting in charging me the 2.5% more in my supplies than what you began with, and what I expected would be the rule you should stick to. Had I judged you capable of taking such an advantage without my approval, I would never have dealt with you, nor am I yet so involved with you that I can easily be off. Chapman Abraham was among the early merchants of Detroit, and in 1765 he was selling rum in partnership with a man by the name of Lyons, possibly Benjamin Lyon. Before them was Isaac Miranda, a Jew who, posing as a fashionable Christian, gained the political appointment of judge, swearing his oath upon a New Testament, but his honor was soon dismissed for defrauding the Indians. Sending their packhorse trail across the mountains, the Jewish merchants fully hoped to dominate the western trade, to control mercantile sales, to build new towns and colonies, and to populate the vast territory between the Alleghenies and the Mississippi. This required the expulsion of the owners and reallocation of the valuable land and resources, a fitting assignment for the royal forces of Britain and France. Jews as military contractors. The pioneer Jews were squarely aligned with the Europeans, primarily the British, and were suppliers of their military. It was they who ox-trained to the distant fortresses with all of the necessities for the troops to maintain their position, some with exclusive contracts with London. Army supplies, says Marcus, was, in consequence, a big business, and it was a business which the Jews knew well. Some of them were massive suppliers, involved in operations requiring sums of money in the millions. Others were petty sutlers or army peddlers. Supplies as big business came into its own during the vast military operation required by the French and Indian War. The large French and English armies had to be provisioned, and both armies looked to Jewish suppliers for food. Jacob Franks and son David of Philadelphia had contracts for provisioning British troops totaling over 750,000 francs. George III of England signed authorizations to pay Moses Franks for supplies to the North American troops, and Joseph Simon supplied the British in Pontiac's War of 1761 to 1764. Later, the firm of Simon, Levy, and Franks managed to secure the highly profitable Fort Charles provisions contract to supply the English troops stationed there. In the French and Indian War, Marcus reports that the New Yorkers did a thriving business as sutlers and shopkeepers, satisfying the wants of soldiers and militiamen. The Anglo-Dutch merchant Uriah Hendricks reportedly did considerable trade with the British Army. The Jewish firm of Lyon and Company supplied the infamous British General Geoffrey Amherst, and, according to documents, Chaim Meyer and Gershom Levy were also suppliers of Amherst's troops. In fact, the conquest of Canada, a major military operation, involved numbers of Jewish tradesmen, including Aaron Hart, a Bavarian Jew who became a notable Canadian businessman in the post-revolutionary period. Other Jews in the trade were gun dealers Samuel Judah and Naphtali Hart Myers, Samson Simpson, Haman Levy, Joseph Bueno, Simpson Levy, and Nathan Levy. Again, Dr. Marcus could not have been clearer about the motive of the Jewish war supply operation. It was also during the French and Indian War that Jewish merchants of Philadelphia and Lancaster helped supply the army and the militia in their efforts to crush the Indians on the Transalpine western frontier. German Jews fought in the Royal American Regiment in the war against the Indian, both as officers and privates. In 1774, during Cresap's War, which saw the Indians raised to save their hunting grounds from the oncoming settlers, another of Joseph Simon's firms, Simon and Campbell's, sold supplies to the Virginia troops in Pittsburgh, and also helped outfit and finance the soldiers and workmen repairing and building Fort Pitt and Fort Fincastle, present-day Wheeling. They appear, seemingly, in every conflict as suppliers of either or both sides. Marcus confirms that the tomahawk, the weapon probably believed to have been manufactured by the marauding Indians, may have been sold or given to them by Jews. Matthias Bush, another member of the Lancaster, Philadelphia Jewish merchantry, supplied Philadelphia with relatively large amounts of arms and munitions. The same accounts credited Benjamin Franklin with 100 tomahawks, which he no doubt supplied for the use of loyal Indian allies. Jews and smallpox. Geoffrey Amherst, the genocidal commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America, came in 1758 to fight the French, after gaining a solid reputation as a British officer in Germany in the War of the Australian Succession. One of his responsibilities in his new position was to annihilate the Indian population, and it was he who conceived the strategy to spread smallpox among them by way of infecting gift blankets. His greatest adversary was Chief Pontiac, who had organized a coalition of Indian tribes to defend their homeland and had been successful in frustrating the European encroachments. Amherst felt that the Native American was the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, and whose riddance from it must be esteemed a meritorious act, for the good of mankind, and who should, upon capture, immediately be put to death, their extirpation being the only security for our future safety, and their late, treacherous proceedings deserve no better treatment from our hands. Amherst's pathological hatred for the Indian knew no limits. Coexistence was not an option. In a postscript of a 1763 letter to Colonel Henry Bouquet, Amherst wrote, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox amongst these disaffected tribe of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." Rabbi Scharfman explained the events that followed and the involvement of the Jewish Indian traders. Captain Acquire called upon Levi Andrew Levi at his trading post. He told how he tricked the chief into accepting the deadly gifts and placed an order to replace the blankets and handkerchiefs. This grim invoice accompanied the new goods, receipt of which was duly acknowledged by a choir. Debtor, the Crown of Levi, Trent and Company, for sundries had by order of Captain Simeon A. Choir, Commandant, to sundries, got to replace in kind those which were taken from the people in the hospital to convey the smallpox to the Indians. 2 blankets at $2. 1 silk handkerchief at 10 cents. 1 linen dude $0.03.6. Total, $2.13.6. Fort Pitt, August 15, 1763. I do hereby certify that the above articles were had for the uses above mentioned. S.A. Choir, Captain, Commandant. 70 Shawnee, Mingo, and Delaware Indians fell before the unseen enemy, smallpox. Many more undoubtedly died, for the Indians had no resistance to the white man's disease. The inevitable defeat of the Indians left vast tracts of land available for white development, and the Indian traders were the primary beneficiary. There was only one hope on which the future of Western commerce could be secured, writes Rabbi Scharfman. Indian land to which the Jewish and Quaker firms had rightful claims. Both sought compensation for their losses at Bloody Run near Fort Detroit, suffered during the Pontiac Uprising in 1763. Though fierce competition divided the two major Western firms in the Ohio, they united to seek joint compensation. Simon, Levi, and Franks, in concert with Bainton, Wharton, and Morgan, claimed their despoiled goods totaled an astronomical 86,000 pounds. Referring to themselves as suffering traders, the merchant princes of the Western trade consolidated to form a land company by which they attempted to gain compensation in Indian land. They called their proposed colony the Indian Company, seeking Indian territory south of the Ohio, in western Virginia, the region then known as Indiana. On November 5, 1768, 3,000 men from the Iroquois Six Nations bartered 4 trinkets and goods an immense expanse of territory stretching from western New York to eastern Kentucky. Of this, the Jewish and Quaker Indiana Company would receive 2.5 million acres of land eventually divided into the states of Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia. As each tribe succumbed to either disease, slaughter, or retreat, rightful claims were made. On July 5, 1773, the different tribes of the Indian nations in Illinois conveyed to 22 residents of Lancaster and the surrounding country a tract of land that now encompasses the southern half of Illinois. 8 Jews were interested in its purchase: Moses Franks, Jacob Franks, David Franks, Bernard Gratz, Michael Gratz, Moses Franks Jr., Joseph Simon, and smallpox co-conspirator Levi Andrew Levi. It was only a matter of time before the pogrom, ethnic cleansing, reduced the once mighty Indian nations to but a few Holocaust survivors. Those who had won the trust of the Indians were the greatest benefactors of their extinction. Augusta Levi, wife of Winnebago Indian trader John Meyer Levi, witnessed the Indians' expulsion from the Minnesota area in 1848 with these words. In the spring there was a great excitement over the removal of the Indians. John was very glad they were going. He had had enough of the Indians. There are other references to Jews and Indians in the Jewish historical record. In the Battle of Beecher Island, the little Jew, Sigmund Schlesinger, 1848–1928, entered into his diary on Monday, September 21, 1868, that he had scalped 3 Indians, which were found about 15 feet from my hole concealed in grass, for purposes of collecting bounty. Records show that as late as the 1880s, Solomon Bebo, of New Mexico, was charged with defrauding the Indians of grazing land. The disregard for the humanity of the red man and woman is demonstrated in the scholarship of the foremost Jewish historian, Jacob Rader Marcus, who describes the mockery of an Indian by Chaim Meyer's Wild West show, and further calls it the spirit of enterprise. Like many of his fellow merchants in the Canadian fur trade, Myers had suffered reverses during the French and Indian War, and presumably in the Indian uprising that followed it. To recoup his fortunes, he he had his friend Samson Simon intercede with Sir William Johnson for former permission to exhibit some Mohawks in Europe. Myers sailed with the Indians before the proper certificate was forthcoming from the Indian Commissioner, and had already begun to parade them in Holland and in the taverns of London when the Lord of Trade urged Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader in New York to have Johnson put an end to the undertaking. From all indication, Myers made no money on his grand European tour, for he ended up owing the Indians money or refusing to pay them. Then, as now, there was no business like show business. Jews and the American Revolution. The American Revolution approached. Jews, who by this time numbered nearly 1,500, became the subject of concern among the colonists when it was widely believed that they were acting in accord with the royal wishes of London rather than their colonial brethren. As a result of the French and Indian War, England proposed one of the largest empires in the world with a debt of £140 million, approximately one half of which was incurred in defending the American colonies. The King of England, therefore, felt it was well within his rights to tax and regulate the commerce of the colonist to offset this huge liability. Of course, his subjects in the colonies disagreed and implemented a number of measures to protest and avoid these edicts. The Stamp Act was enacted and then repealed by Parliament, and the tax on tea cost more to collect than it took in, so it was also abandoned. But the tax on sugar and molasses, the critical and profitable link in the slave trade, had the potential to cripple the colonial commerce. Britain sent to the New England coast 27 warships with soldiers and revenue agents to enforce the tax. Outraged, the colonial merchants joined in non-importation agreements, refusing to purchase British goods, calling such taxation without representation tyranny, all except the Newport merchants, chiefly Jews, who carried on their trade as usual. Merchants in other colonies felt that those Rhode Islanders were taking advantage of their loss by maintaining their trade relations with the enemy. Resentment in other colonies turned into rage, wrote historian David Lovejoy, when it was reported in several places that the non-importation agreement had broken down completely in Newport. Rumors spread that 3 vessels from London had unloaded in Newport, and not only had they sold their goods, but it was claimed that the Newporters were actually advertising them for sale. An increasing number of people in other colonies became insensitive at Rhode Island and launched a general boycott of the colony's trade. Only after 8 colonies had placed a temporary embargo on their trade did the Newport merchants honor the non-importation pact. In Lovejoy's book Rhode Island Politics, 1760 to 1776, he explains the issue. The blame for breaking the non-importation agreement was primarily laid at the feet of the Jews. The irate merchants of Boston claim that the Newport culprits were chiefly Jews, while Ezra Stiles reported that 5 or 6 Jews and 3 or 4 Tories had drawn down vengeance upon a whole country. Ezra Stiles singled out Aaron Lopez as the chief violator. Because he refused to come into the agreement, the customs officials showed him great lenity, lenience, and favor. The captains of his 25 vessels were exempted from swearing their cargoes at the customs house, while oaths were strictly exacted from all those who had agreed not to import English goods. Once, by mistake, a man-of-war in the harbor seized one of Lopez's vessels with a cargo of wine, which was being taken off at night by 5 small boats. Stiles was no bigot. He had great admiration for the Jews of Newport, often attended their services in Truro Synagogue, and read Hebrew with the rabbis. When he blamed them for violating the non-importation agreement, he probably knew what he was talking about. But this was not the only place where Jews openly defied the revolution. While the Bostonians were throwing tea from British vessels into the Boston harbor, the Gratzes of Philadelphia smuggled it into America. Though impossible to sell this tea in the super-patriotic cities of the East Coast, another Jew, Joseph Simon, did offer it for sale in some of his stores near Pittsburgh. When discovered, the Patriots resolved to put a stop to it, and on the night of August 24, 1775, they confiscated the unsold contraband and burned it. A Newport Jew named Pollock, having imported tea contrary to the command of the Rhode Islanders, was driven from the Caribbean islands of St. Eustatius with loss of all his property. In 1776, the Continental Congress was having doubt as to the neutrality of Jewish trader David Franks and his ability to conduct business without passing information to the enemy. The Congress may have been reacting to the known history of Jews in the Caribbean conflict of the previous century. Stephen Fortune has written that merchants in Barbados in 1667 strongly suspected that Jews were passing military secrets to enemy troops. The merchants were indeed aware that Jews had offered intelligence and army supplies to Cromwell in the conquest of Jamaica, and in the grandiose plan for the conquest of Chile and Peru. They may also have recalled how quickly and easily Jamaican Sephardic Jews changed their allegiance from Spain to England after the conquest of Jamaica in 1655. Observing the long history of Jews as victuallers, a person who was licensed to sell alcohol, and intelligencers, the colonists questioned their loyalty. Jews were perceived as opportunists and masters of duplicity, deception, with loyalties colored by hopes of profit. There is much evidence to show that many Jews decided to remain loyal to the Crown in the American Revolution. Many of these loyalist Jews were from Newport, Rhode Island. Some were openly in favor of Britain and some tried to remain neutral, but decided that their conscious and economic interests led them to loyalty to Great Britain. The British, after all, were the muscle behind the economic advances of the Jews. Many who were Indian traders found their fortune claiming the spoils of British extermination policies. Jews, with their interregional shipping network and high-volume commercial enterprise, stood the most to lose from colonial independence. The protection of their ships by the British Navy and the stability of the British monetary system were reason enough to resist the cry of their fellow colonists for freedom. Not only were the Jews economically aligned with the British, but they provided the weapons for the ensuing battle. British military supply and the Jews. Even as their communities vacillated, the Jews saw the opportunities in the lucrative military supply trade. Many, if not most, Jewish merchants of that day were purveyors on a large or small scale. As in the French and Indian War, Jewish military suppliers provisioned the British forces, and one, Jacob Franks, was appointed an official purveyor of the British Army. When the Revolution broke out in 1775, Samuel Jacob undertook to provision British regulators and German missionaries in Canada. Jacobs was, and remained, a staunch loyalist and had no sympathy for the Americans. Chapman Abraham was an accredited British loyalist, and in a letter written in 1778, emphasized his loyal conduct towards the British and his animosity toward the rebels. He mentioned that he supplied several regiments during the war, was one of those who repelled the rebels at Long Point, and served as a volunteer with the troops when the Americans were defeated at Three Rivers. Other Jews in the military supply trade were Ezekiel and Levi Solomons, Benjamin Lyon, and Gershom Levi. Some other notable Jews included in a list of British loyalists were Solomon Aaron, ABM, J. Abrahams, David Franks, Jacob Franks, Abraham Gomez, Moses Gomez, Jr., Isaac Hart, Barak Hayes, Moses Gomez, Jr., Moses Michael Hayes, Uriah Hendricks, Levi Israel, Aaron Kaiser, Phil Hayes, Joseph Solomon Cohn, David Levison, Henry Marks, Jacob Mayer, Rachel Myers, Samuel Myers, David Nathan, Meyer Pollock, Sam Samuel, Isaac Solomon, Isaac Turo. Turo and Rachel Myers had to flee Newport when the British left, as did Isaac Hart, who lost his life and fortune for his alliance to the Crown. Summary. The Jewish influence over the burgeoning, expanding, colonial commerce had been well established in key seaport locations by the American Revolution. The trade channels of the Caribbean had now expanded to include the North American settlements, and Jews were clearly the pioneers. The overland routes to the western fur trading posts were well worn by Jewish peddlers, and supply routes to the royal armies almost exclusively carry the goods of Jewish merchants. They exploited these opportunities and gained advantages by rooting themselves firmly in the urban centers of the New World. With the Jews and their skillful commercial practices came their black slaves. The condition of the black African remained unchanged with this northward migration. He adapted to the commercial flexibility of the various Jewish enterprises, providing these essential ingredients, skill and brawn, which made the Latin/Jewish experience so profitable. For the first time, Jews settled into an environment amenable to their economic and social interest, with the freedom to pursue opportunities and, as far as the Africans were concerned, with little moral restraint. As in the settlements to the north, the American South provided opportunities for Jewish entrepreneurial activity. Agricultural, farming, cotton, tobacco, rice, and corn, commerce was familiar to the New World Jewish experience, and this experience and the sweat and blood of the black slave facilitated the transition. Chapter 3. Jews in the South. For the most part, they had acquired wealth and owned numerous slaves who they exploited for the development of their resources. Their prosperity and long tenancy had won them prestige equal to that of the non-Jewish natives, and they were not only completely at home amid their surroundings, but, naturally, supported and sanctioned the institution that had been so prosperous to them, providing them with wealth, position, and comfort. Like other wealthy Southern land and slave owners, they were convinced that their financial stability depended upon maintaining the service of the Negro slaves. It is, therefore, hardly surprising that they became staunch upholders of the slavery system, in their unwillingness to relinquish these personal benefits.